my name is Biodun Awojobi. I'm a customer engineering manager at Google. I lead a team of CE specialists, CE meaning customer engineers, technical specialists in different workload areas of GCP. And today I'm joined by Wade Walters, who's also a customer engineer focused specifically in security. Wade, I know you were having some audio issues. I don't know if you can hear us now.
I'm on now, Bio.
Wonderful. All right, so I will present my screen because I was like, hey, wait is starting, so how do we start now? All right, I'll have my screen presented and I'll let you do an intro as well as soon as we have this teed up. All right, Wade, take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Bio said, my name is Wade Walters. I'm a customer engineer here at Google. I've been here about a year and a half, focused specifically on the security suite of products that we have. Bio and I thought that based on some feedback that we had from Jim and from you guys in previous sessions, that what we do is we'd spend a little bit of time kicking this off, talking about kind of modern approaches to cybersecurity, and then putting that specifically into the context of ransomware and giving you a little bit more insight about how that works. So Bio, if you want to go ahead and advance the slides. So as we think about our modern security approaches, what are we really dealing with? And as we look at that threat landscape, there are innumerable types of threats that are out there. We're constantly seeing them appear inside of news headlines around the world. We see data breaches happening on a regular basis. We see account hijacking taking place. We even see some things like insider threat taking place. And where that really is coming from is from a number of different things. Oftentimes, security teams are overworked. They're under-resourced. They don't have the ability to be able to go through and take all the time that they need to make sure that everything's configured properly across their suite of technologies, making sure that, as an example, accounts are being turned on and off or granted the appropriate level of access for whatever their job role or function is inside of that. A lot of times, they have weak controls in place, especially around cloud environments, as those are typically less ingrained than a lot of the on-prem workloads. And so there's a lot of challenges really as we look at that threat landscape. Next slide. So there's a couple of different ways for you to really be able to address or kind of wrap your arms around really dealing with the various threat actors that exist out there. And one of the ways for you to be able to do that is to utilize an industry recognized framework or standard. One of those happens to be the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And you can see here, I know it's a little bit of an eye chart. You don't really have to sweat that. It's less about seeing the details and really more about understanding how this progress or how this attack progresses. This began at Lockheed Martin with the kill chain and then has evolved over time into the attack framework. And the idea behind this is really understanding where the vulnerabilities are, where you're exposed across different parts of that particular attack. You think about things like reconnaissance, whether that be physical or virtual, whether that be pinging your edge, looking for a way in, whatever it might be, progressing through initial access, getting a foothold inside the environment, escalating privileges, being able to discover the assets and data that's inside the environment, moving laterally throughout the systems, eventually taking systems over and becoming a persistent threat inside the environment. Next slide. We really kind of simplified that with this attack methodology for the enterprise. And obviously you can see what an excellent PowerPoint jockey I am. So I couldn't manage to get any of the lines straight on this thing, and the colors all changed on my arrows. So don't hold my security knowledge against my PowerPoint knowledge and skill for that. But effectively, what this becomes is a much simpler way for you to be able to understand how the attack progresses. And so as you start to identify if you're not familiar, TTPs and IOCs. So TTPs are tactics, techniques, and process, and then IOCs are indicators of compromise. These would be data points that you would see activity happening inside of your environment. And those would be the types of things that would give you the ability with that more detailed and comprehensive view of the MITRE ATT&CK framework to be able to understand where in the attack it's taking place. Things like lateral movement, for example, sensitive data moving between systems that shouldn't necessarily have it. You know you've already been compromised at that point. You've been popped. So now it becomes a matter of how do I mitigate that lateral movement? How do I put a stop to that type of thing? Those would be examples of essentially the progression of the attack and the technologies that we'll talk about here in a little bit that you would be able to use to be able to do some mitigation on that. Next slide. Another way for us to really look at this, and the simpler one that Bio and I have chosen to really focus on today, is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And so the National Institute of Standards and Technologies has spent a lot of time putting together various assets and resources around good approaches to cybersecurity. They've broken it down, obviously much simpler than that full MITRE ATT&CK framework looks like. But it kind of comes down into 5 main areas or 5 buckets of responsibility. The first is identification. So that's not just identification of your environment, identification of your assets, and identification of your threats. It's also identification of what your resources are to be able to combat whatever attack you're facing, being able to identify who's available, what processes are going to be utilized for you to be able to go through and identify and mitigate these threats. The next piece of that, protect, is actually about establishing essentially what the posture is going to be for the environment while not disrupting your business operations, whatever they might be. So you want to make sure that you're taking the time to understand what technologies would be most applicable and most useful, and also the ones that would provide obviously the most bang for the buck, as well as allowing efficient operation of the business to be able to continue. Detect is a particularly important one. If you are not able to detect the attack taking place, then you're obviously not going to be able to do anything about it. And there's a number of different ways for you to be able to go about detecting, some active, some passive, various different elements. When you think about honeypots as an example, deception capabilities that exist out there, even more historical things like logging in the environment to make sure that you're maintaining a record of the activity that's taking place in the environment. These types of things all give you the ability to actually discover and detect activities in your environment in a timely manner. What that leads to then is your ability to be able to respond. Obviously, a very key component to this. The sooner you're able to detect the threat, the earlier you can actually respond to it, and therefore the more you mitigate whatever the impact to that is going to be. In a lot of cases, response can be automated, but it is something that you need to have the process in place, and it needs to be periodically reviewed to make sure that the response is appropriate, while also recognizing that there will be times that you actually have to get in and do that threat response in a much more manual and much more specific fashion. The last element, obviously, is your ability to be able to recover. And so when we talk about business continuity, disaster recovery, whether that be something like a natural disaster, like a hurricane taking a data center offline for a while, or whether that be something from a cybersecurity perspective, like the ransomware examples that Bio will talk through a little bit later, you really want to be able to understand what your state to be able to recover is, and actually go through and take the time to practice your recovery processes as well. That's one of the things. I started out as an admin 20 years ago, backup tapes, and I remember half the time they didn't work. And so we got into a process of routinely going through and validating that the backups were good to make sure if we did need to recover anything, we had the ability to be able to do that. If any of you are old Novell guys and gals, if you remember Filer, that thing saved my bacon more than once as we were able to go through and recover old volumes old versions of files that the engineers had deleted by mistake. So having a good recovery practice in place obviously is a key element to make sure that the business continues to run. Next slide. So let's dive in a little bit more into the protection. So we'll talk about a couple of different things about ways to actually go through and protect your environment. Brought this slide up. This actually comes from Google Cloud. This is our approach to security, but I thought it was valuable for a number of different reasons. Google, as one of the largest and broadest networks across the globe, with a lot of cable being run everywhere, takes defense in depth very seriously at the scale of the network. We joke that you're basically one hop away from just about anywhere in the world from accessing Google's network. And so as we approach this from a bottom-up approach, we look first at the hardware. And so we've got custom-built hardware that's in all of our data centers. If any of you guys really geek out on chips, you may have heard about the tensor processing unit that has recently come out. It's actually going into the Pixel 6. That's one way for us to be able to manage and secure our infrastructure. The next piece of that becomes what we call service deployment. And so there's various applications, various services that are running on top of that bare metal. You guys may think of it as something simple like ads or search or maps or whatever, but all of those services and the way that they're deployed are done in kind of a least privileged fashion to make sure that we're only providing enough for a particular service, and even some of the sub-services that you guys wouldn't be familiar with that are actually the underpinnings for a lot of those capabilities, or making sure that they only have the limited amount of permissions that they need to be able to do that. Storage is important because obviously with a lot of data that we're ripping through on a daily basis as we're going through and indexing the internet as an example, or the maps function is another example, all of these services have to be secured to make sure that we've got good data, that we're able to use that data in an appropriate fashion and only use it for the methods and means that we want to be able to use it. Identity becomes a very key element for us. You'll hear Bio and I talk about this a couple of different times, but the way we operate our network is through a zero trust methodology, and that's a whole story for another day around that. That dates back to some issues that we had in the early 2010s. But what that really means is the identity of me as a user and my device are inextricably tied together through hardware multi-factor, as well as the permission levels that I have as a user and the configuration of my device. And so that becomes something that is constantly authenticated and validated inside the network, and that applies to all of us. And so when we think about those 3 layers or those 4 layers, they're applicable to the business that you're in the same way that it's applicable to us. Wanting to be able to make sure that you've got secure identity that's regularly validated, making sure that you're only putting the permissions in place and only allowing resources for the service to the level that you need it to, and making sure that the physical hardware is secure as well. The last 2 elements on the top, your operational and device security, touched a little bit on that with our security posture, things like endpoint management, endpoint policy configuration, those types of things, as well as being able to go through and make sure that the devices are updated and secured and that type of thing. And then connecting out to the internet. We know that it can tend to be the Wild West, and once you're out there, you tend to be a little bit exposed, especially if you don't have any technologies in place. I think simple things like a firewall, for example, that provide the ability to be able to help you for that. So as we look at this in a very layered fashion to be able to understand that they all build on themselves to give us this defense in depth. And we think it's a common enough approach or universal enough approach that it's a way for you to be able to approach your security posture as well. Next slide. So I did this on purpose because Jim said don't use a lot of acronyms. So I created an alphabet soup as much as I possibly could just to show you what the challenges are that security teams face today. There's all kinds of different technologies that exist out there, whether you're looking at on-prem environments, whether you're looking at any of the public cloud entities, even if you're trying to do public cloud. Not all of these are going to be things that everyone is going to need to use, but they are things that are available that are part of that, call it security vendor landscape, to offset the critical threats that exist across your attack surface. We talked about firewalls as an example, being a traditional perimeter type of technology. We know now from working from home for most of us for the last year and a half, VPN concentrators have become a very valuable commodity to be able to give remote users access to the environment. A lot of that is true, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. You've got other things like being able to go through and make sure your data is encrypted, whether that be at rest, whether that be in transit, and regardless of where that sits and it's moving, you want to be able to have that data encrypted from there. You may have some compliance or regulatory requirements that you have to follow. Those can be drivers for some of the technologies that exist out there. Something like MFA or 2FA, so multi-factor or two-factor authentication, something that's pretty common across footprints these days, to be able to go through and essentially validate that the identity and the person are who they say they are. You've got things like UEBA, user entity behavioral analytics, kind of a newer buzzword that's come out in the last few years, building off kind of the concept of data analytics, where now user behavior is being watched as well. And so you have concepts like the impossible login, for example, where I'm based here in Dallas and I log in at 4:53 in the afternoon, and 2 minutes later, my account is used to log in from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Impossible login is not possible to have traveled that distance. The UEBA stuff would be the type of thing that would call that out and identify that as a potential concern. Things like XDR and NDR. XDR in particular is one of the newest buzzwords that's out there. Essentially, that's looking at endpoint or network detection and response. There's a number of different ways to do that. Some ways are with SOARs, so security operations and automation response or automated response. So SOAR platforms, or XSOAR, as some of them call it, give you a way to do some of that automated response. Some of that even ties into more traditional DevOps functions, where you'd have the ability, say, to fire off a Kubernetes cluster, be able to use things like Terraform to be able to build out your container configurations and those types of things. You got traditional stuff that's been around for a long time, IDS and IPS, so intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. There's a whole side philosophical discussion about IDS or IPS and which one's better, but they're still out there. You've got things like ACL, so your access control list, to be able to manage access to the environment. And then you've got things like SIEMs. So your security information and event management has been around for a long time in various flavors. Many players have come and gone. These are things that are designed to aggregate a volume of data across multiple different technologies, give you the ability to be able to correlate that information, and then hopefully get alerted to things, the bad things that are happening inside the environment. So there's a lot of different ways for you to be able to approach that security stack, a lot of ways basically for you to be able to build the cake. Obviously, having a hybrid environment increases the challenges a little bit, because while some technologies are complementary and are able to exist in both places, some of them are not, and that requires oftentimes duplicating effort across technologies. But never fear, there are ways to be able to move past this. Next slide. So the way that we'll address that is in the context of detect and response inside of NIST. And so when we think about good security programs and what they're doing, they're wearing many hats. A lot of times you've got small teams where multiple hats are being worn by the same person or by the same team. Infrequently do you see teams that are well resourced enough that they're siloed into full specialties across the spectrum of capabilities. But there are a number of different things that they have in common, regardless of what the operational face looks like with that. You have things on the left side over there, your governance, risk, and compliance. So there are things that are going to be drivers for the business. Financial services, for example, has a lot of regulatory requirements. Healthcare, you've got retail, or any card processor with things like PCI. So number of different regulatory requirements out there and frameworks that you can follow to be able to map into those. But really what that is about what understanding the risk to the environment actually is. Who's coming after me? Why are they coming after me? What's important? What are they going to be looking for when they come in here? And one of the things that I would need to do to be able to mitigate that, as well as be able to validate for the auditors that I actually am doing these things. And we find that that's often a challenge for organizations from a time perspective to be able to do that. On the far side of that, over on the right side, we have the concept of the true threat hunter. And so when we think about security monitoring and operations, the idea that you're actually going through, preventing threats, detecting threats, hunting inside of your data for things that are happening low and slow that you don't know about, and then being able to respond to the things that you do find inside of that. And this, a lot of times, much more than the compliance side of it, is where we find people actually interested and enjoying their jobs as they work their way through that. Effectively, the ability to be able to solve the puzzle as you're looking at the attacks. In the middle of that, though, you've got essentially kind of the big blocks of the types of things that they would be working for that. You've got IAM, so your identity and access management. We talked a little bit about identity before. Being able to understand as you're onboarding and offboarding employees, being able to turn those accounts on and back off, being able to make sure that they have appropriate permissions, they've got appropriate access to the applications that they'll need, that type of thing, and being able to validate on a periodic basis that the user or device is who they say that it is. Endpoint security, we know it's kind of table stakes at this point. It's been around forever. We've called it antivirus, we've called it XDR, we've called it EDR, any number of different acronyms for that. But the idea is that the device you're using is secured, it's updated with the appropriate level of patches, you're mitigating vulnerabilities or removing vulnerabilities based off of services being removed and that type of thing, and that you're managing that on a regular basis. Maybe you're using something like an MDM solution to be able to provide that capability. Maybe you're just using something like GPOs in Windows, but whatever it might be, that policy enforcement is really designed to make sure that you're maintaining security of that device as well. If you've got more cloud workloads, then you get into a little bit more application security type of stuff, especially if you're doing anything homegrown or in-house. Obviously, that's something that we spend a lot of time as an organization working on. In particular, the idea of being able to secure your APIs. There are vendors that exist out there to help you be able to do that, to identify misconfigured APIs and be able to correct that. Going through and making sure that you're scanning and testing that on an ongoing basis to make sure that those APIs remain secure is going to be important as well. It's something that's a key component, especially for cloud-based workloads. When we talk about data security, that's really the ability to understand what data inside your environment is important, what level of performance or importance or criticality it has, essentially being able to label or tag that data inside the environment, enforcing access to appropriate levels of data inside the environment, and being able to ultimately make sure that that sensitive data is not exfiltrated outside of the environment. Now, that's not necessarily done only through malicious threat actor. That can also be insider threat. That can even also be accidental exfiltration, where somebody that has access, the old salary spreadsheet example, gets sent off to somebody else that they shouldn't have it or didn't know it was attached or whatever it might be. So keep in mind, those aren't always nefarious or malicious in nature. Network security is something that's ongoing. I touched a little bit about the fluid nature of the perimeter earlier and how things have changed so substantially for so many organizations in the last year and a half. Being able to define and understand what that perimeter actually is and how liquid it is in your environment with your remote workforce is something that's high significance right now, because every time you poke a hole in a firewall to be able to allow a service to traverse, or every time you use a VPN concentrator to allow another user to have access inside the environment, you're making a hole inside that perimeter and increasing your level of risk associated with that. Being able to do network segmentation is something that has increased in use in the last few years, especially micro-segmentation, where you're really breaking the network down into smaller pieces and making sure that as you work your way through that you're making sure, in particular, things like lateral movement and accidental data loss aren't happening through that. Remote access, we touched on a little bit. If you're in the cloud, and even if you're on-prem and hosting your own data center, being able to do DDoS protection is something that's key. Anecdote for you guys, last year, had like 2.3 terabyte per second DOS attack against Google. We just shrugged it off. Not a big deal. Think about the scale that we've got for that. Just thought that was something that was cool. And then the last piece, when we talk about infrastructure, I touched on this a little bit earlier, hardening of the devices, ongoing configuration management, whether that's patches or vulnerability management around that. A lot of that's really based off of the policies and procedures you put in place just making sure that you're following through on that. But ultimately, this set of layers gives you the ability to be able to kind of have that defense in depth that we talked about earlier. Next slide. So this is by no means comprehensive. This is by no means a recommendation for any of these types of technologies or any of these specific vendors. This just happens to be a set of vendors that have capabilities or have technologies to be able to satisfy these different capabilities in this security stack. Really, all I wanted to do with this is just reinforce the idea that when we talked about that traditional hybrid environment and all of those technologies that exist out there, these are some of those names that are associated with those. There's a lot more out there. These companies, some have been around for a long time, some of them have not. We continue to see in the startup community new logos coming up every day around that because the VCs just can't stop spending money. So anyway, just to give you an idea of the breadth of vendors out here, this is nothing but a taste. Next slide. So we talked about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the 5 different pillars, so to speak, around that. Really what this boils down to is when you think about identifying threats, assets, resources, whatever, you want to be able to make sure that you're identifying what your criticality is, discovering the breadth of what exists out there, especially as you think about, the shadow IT that exists in the cloud and the guy that's got the server sitting under his desk in the office, all of those types of things, being able to go through and manage your risk as much as possible by having an understanding of what the assets are inside the environment and where your exposure exists. Protect is really about the idea that you're going to go through and protect your data in a number of different ways. There's technologies that you put in place to be able to prevent threats from coming in to start with. And then there's ongoing process around making sure that you've got adequate protections in place, whether you're doing something relatively new, like a zero trust architecture inside your environment, whether you're focused on identity and access controls, whether you're focused on file integrity monitoring or lateral movement, those types of things are all there. Detect is a really important piece to this because this is really about collecting the information that's being generated or should be being generated inside your environment and putting that into something. So the logging, configuration, and monitoring, where you're able to go through and review on a periodic basis in some kind of aggregated fashion what the different technology sets are telling you. Your endpoint technology is going to tell you one thing. Your firewall technology is going to tell you another. Those two taken in together might tell you a story of something you want to be able to go investigate, or might notify you that they've detected something that you want to be able to go investigate or dig into in further detail. That leads obviously to the response, the idea being that you've got incident response playbooks, you have analysts that are set up to respond to different types of attacks or different types of threats. There are a litany of ways for you to be able to go through and based on the technologies you've got, what the response is going to be, what mitigation strategy is, what reporting needs to look like, any of those types of things. And then finally, the recovery, like we talked about earlier, being able to very quickly restore business operations, regardless of what the event you're trying to recover from actually is, being able to make sure that data that you're recovering to is actually useful data, it's valid data, and that it's data that's not still at risk from issues you might have, like the ransomware events that Bio is about to touch on now. Next slide.
I think you're done, Wade.
Yep,
Great job.
Bio. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to start out the conversation by just rehashing what Wade had just mentioned in terms of the NIST cybersecurity framework. The first part of the NIST cybersecurity framework that I'm going to be touching on is the identify phase, and I'll use that to kind of lay the narrative of what are we facing and run through a couple of stats. Attack tactics remain consistent. I don't know if you all knew this, but 80% of attacks start with a phishing email. 94% of these email-borne threats have malware installed via emails or attachments. 21% of Americans also have experienced a ransomware attack, and it's staggering to know that 46% of them say of the companies say that they've actually paid the ransom. You all are probably familiar with a lot of the ransomware attacks, which have actually increased in intensity in the past couple of months, especially in the past 2 years with COVID around the corner. Uh, from the T-Mobile attack, from the DHS colonial attack, the one that DHS announced, from the pipeline attacks, from what we're hearing with new attacks just springing up. There are like new emails or new the security feeds that I follow talked about a couple of other attacks that are popping up from a security company, from security companies and from high profile companies as well. The attacks just seem to be very prevalent around us, and they're all ransomware. And the funny thing about all of this is the attacks aren't new. They are attacks that we continue to see every time. The tactics are all the same. But why do we keep falling victim to them? And I'm going to use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework to kind of provide a little bit more clarity as to how can most organizations kind of use that as one of the frameworks that's out there to help better plan and address and for ransomware attacks and just security posture generally in an environment. So uh, I thought the best way when Wade and I were having the chat, I thought the best way to kind of identify and better describe how ransomware work is to use one of the frameworks. Actually, it's called a kill chain, the attack kill chain, which is very popular in the security community to describe how attackers typically get into an environment and create all these ransomware threats. So we call this a ransomware kill chain. An attack kill chain, ransomware kill chain, pretty much all the same. At the first stage, for most attackers, you send a phishing email and you hope that you get a bait. Your phishing email may have some form of attachment in it. Sometimes it may have an email in it. Sometimes it might start out with sending an email to a couple of folks, hoping that they would open it up. You want to wait to see if they actually open it, and then you send another email from a different sender and try to see if you could put an attachment in it and make it urgent. Make it seem like it's something they literally have to do. So the first attack will come via like the email. The email will have like a malicious app in it. You could ask the user to click on the attachment and open it up. When the user opens up the attachment, that could run a malicious code on their endpoint, and that's how the attacks typically start. In some cases, it could be a browser-based attack where you put a link in there, a link that looks so harmless, and you click on the link, it opens up a browser, and your browser may already be taken over as a result of that. The next stage that happens in the third stage was the exploitation and installation phase, where the malicious payload is being downloaded on that endpoint. Once the malicious payload has been downloaded, what typically happens is most of the attackers they pause at this phase. They wait for weeks, sometimes even months, to identify now that I have some form of reconnaissance into this environment. I'm going to watch and try to inspect what are some of the vulnerable machines that are out there. I remember when in my early career, even when Windows 2000 servers were already out of vogue, there were still companies that use Windows 2000 servers that are already vulnerable from a security perspective. There are devices that don't have proper baselines, such that by default they are open and attackers would take advantage of open ports that are vulnerable and try to see how they could inspect for the files that are in there and try to see, hey, maybe I have five lists of machines. Based on these machines, I know how often these files are being opened. I can inspect the file and identify, wow, this file looks like a file that might be a good culprit for a ransomware. Attackers typically will stay in the environment for so long so they can gather data, in most cases exfiltrate data, because it doesn't all have to go through the skill chain. It could happen in the phase 3, 4, and 5, or phase 4, 5, and 6 can be interwoven, just depending on the attack and how they typically the attacker and how they typically operate. What then happens is when you find the vulnerable machines around using that one host that you've taken advantage of, the attacker, you try to spread the malware payload across multiple other machines, especially when you realize that there are vulnerable ports, there are no anti-malware or there are no anti-phishing, there are no security controls in that environment. You try to take advantage of as many devices as possible. The payload may even install additional payload that would take advantage of deploy keyloaders or keyloggers, I apologize, keyloggers on the endpoint. What happens next is the attacker steals the data. I actually argue that in most cases, attackers have already stolen the data and then they encrypt the data and request for a ransom. In most cases, most users are forced to pay the ransom because they don't have, one, the security controls, two, they don't have the backup. So why are they still successful? We'll talk a little bit more about why these attacks are successful in the slide that's next. You get emails. I don't know. I'm sure I know I've received emails like that saying that my Hotmail account is about to be deleted, that I need to click on a link, and I know it's false, so I wouldn't fall victim to that. But a lot of us would get emails like that. The Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. You're asked to download an Excel spreadsheet that has a .NET loader, or a Word document that has a .NET loader, or an Excel spreadsheet that has a macro. Macros are programs that are on an Excel spreadsheet that could literally cause damage or install malicious payload on an endpoint. Sometimes you receive attachments, and the attachments seem like there might be a gold mine in there, but actually, when you open up the attachment, it's downloading binaries on the endpoint, binaries that are malicious on the endpoint. PowerShell, as powerful as Windows PowerShell truly is, if it's not locked down, it could be very powerful in terms of compromising an entire enterprise. So a lot of users, a lot of attackers will use PowerShell attacks to gain reconnaissance of an environment because, I mean, as an example, if you have unrestricted code or untrusted code or unsigned code allowed with your Windows PowerShell, it becomes an issue. There are times where you also have where proper network security practices aren't being put in place in most environments, where when there's a lateral movement, the network doesn't detect it, or when when there's Mimikatz being installed and there's some type of bad signatures running within an environment, the network security solutions aren't in place or aren't properly configured to actually detect those. These are just a couple. There are way more. Also, I mean, this is just a bit of a statistics around the distribution of malware in general. In 2020, as you can see, 83% of malware was accounted for from a Windows perspective. In 2019, the number was 78%, so there was a significant jump. And obviously, COVID must have accounted for this, so a part of this type of data that we're seeing right here. From a browser perspective as well, as you could see, 11.9% of browser-based attacks were malware related in 2020, and in 2019 we have 15.86. And then you can kind of look at some of the common themes that we're seeing even from an Android device and from the other device categories that are specified in that survey. So what do we do to protect? I'll talk a little bit about the Google approach, but most importantly, I'm going to talk about more of the general concepts that's known to the industry, we all can start doing better of implementing. There are key three themes that we at Google preach. The zero trust model, as Wade had mentioned earlier, trust nothing, detect everything. So we build on a planet scale security analytics, ingesting multiple data points, applying ML on those multiple data points, and making sure that the multiple data points that we have, we can detect what a good IP address is, what a bad IP address is, what a good file is, because we may have seen the file sent to multiple Gmail accounts and already been reported as a malware, or our security solution has already filed the or flagged the file based on its hash value as vulnerable. And then protect everyone. And that kind of goes back to the ML concept that I've mentioned. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. This is not unique to only Google, by the way. Other companies have data real estate. But if there's anything that I would identify though that Google has, it's in the scale of data that we have. It starts from search. It goes to Gmail. It goes to a lot of the Google solutions that we all use and love. But using the data points, because we have that level of data real estate, we are able to identify where are the attacks coming from. What are the folks in EMEA seeing? What are the folks in North America seeing? What are the folks in other parts of the world seeing? And what are they reporting as vulnerable? And how can we apply intelligence on top of what we're seeing from a signaling perspective and making sure that we're protecting absolutely everyone that uses Google services? This is an important area where we could use the skill or the technology of machine learning to protect from a security perspective. The next step here is I'm going to talk a little bit more about the common vectors. We've listed here three common vectors to kind of identify the threats that we see from a ransomware perspective. Ransomware would typically happen either through phishing, through malware, just like the kill chain has identified, or through credential theft. From a phishing perspective, we at Google, we scan the world. We always do an indexing of the world's internet, of all the web pages in the world. Gmail accounts, there are a ton of them, and we use all that data to stop phishing. And I'll kind of show an example in the next page. So a typical email workflow would look like this. And through all of these processes from left to right, there are steps that can be taken by your email provider or whichever one that you use that could be taken to protect your users. From a delivery perspective, there are security features that you can implement from the front end to reject emails before they've been delivered. When the email comes into your environment, you can sanitize the email running AV checks. When the emails are being opened, you can automatically apply some form of encryption on the email or prevent downloads, just some policy-based mechanisms that you can put in. And all of these are done through that reclassification phase where you could apply deep learning. You could decide to either apply deep learning to emails coming from specific regions. These are just examples of what you could do from an email perspective. You could also run antivirus checks as well. And to top it all off, you can which is something that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. You can apply second step verification to specific actions that are run from an email flow perspective. Say for example, if you're opening a file or you're clicking on a link right from your email, you could ensure that clicking on that link requires that you use your FIDO key, which means that you're not having to type your password and the attacker is not stealing your password. Yet what you're doing is you're using a key which has more security, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Your browser as well. Uh, this is one of those areas that I would say Google has become a visionary. Google was born in the cloud. Literally, all of the solutions that you use from Google can be run from a web browser. So a lot of the security that we do, most of them starts from the browser because that's where you access the data from. And there are multiple capabilities that are built on top of the browser that ensures that there is security. One, from a safe browsing perspective, knowing that hey, there are malicious sites that you're visiting, and we know it as from your Chrome browser knows it, and it flags up an alert. Or an enterprise grade password protection, where you're saving your password on your browsing, your browser is checking the hash of your password against reported breaches to let you know if your password has been found compromised on another site and letting you know in advance so you can actually change those passwords as well. Let's talk a little bit more about malware. I try not to make this very Google specific because most organizations kind of build uh, it's becoming a template for most security companies now to build their malware protection services around these principles. It starts from having a policy engine, policy to detect, a policy that uses IOCs, IOCs meaning indicators of compromise, a policy that has different technologies to capture right from the front end and giving the user access to determine what they would like to block or not. And then AV engine from a signature perspective, as much as we the world is moving to a machine learning based model, we still use AV engines from signatures, making sure that there are signatures that's been reported by other users. We're aggregating that and using those signatures to protect users at scale. And then also we're having context-based protection. Context-based protection, it goes into the machine learning side of the house, where we're able to tell that, hey, this user, I'll give an example here. This user typically doesn't receive emails from Australia, but now the user is receiving an email from Australia. What are we going to do to the email? We're going to add some caution to that. Are we going to add a caution banner to the email, or are we going to deep scan the email before we release the email to the user who it's been sent to? Or there's an email address that we're seeing it that looks malicious, but because 5,000 other Gmail users have received it, and we want to flag and let the user know before the user actually opens it or actually block the user from getting it. That's where machine learning helps. And then we have sandbox facilities or sandbox capabilities. And the idea of sandbox capabilities is where, and most companies are beginning to have this now. So think about that attachment that you receive or that you never received, but the user said, "Hey, I sent you an attachment, but you never received the attachment." Maybe it's because the attachment has a malicious payload on it. There are capabilities that will allow for the email to be released to the end user, but the attachment be held back while we do deeper investigation. You could read the body of the email, but the attachment, if it's been held back into a sandbox area such that it doesn't corrupt your entire mailbox, but at the same time you get to see the context that's coming out of the email. Those are some of the capabilities that you can do using a security sandbox. We will talk about our zero trust model, which is very unique at a later session, but there are a couple of key points that I want to call out here. Our zero trust model at Google is called Beyond Corp, and this is not by any means a sales pitch. But what I want to kind of point out from this page on, from a protection perspective, is there are features that you needs to be addressed, like user identity, device identity, looking at that and looking at security from that lens, looking at security from a machine identity perspective and what specific machines can do, like SALs as an example, and looking at service identity and also code identity as well to set context for access granting, access denial, and also privilege and also user privilege management. That is what true zero trust solutions can offer, and we'll kind of get into that at another session. So now let's talk about credential theft. I may have already given part of the gist away when I talked about the enterprise grade security that you have within Chrome for password protection. But actually, I think there's a little bit more that we can all learn together from here. I don't know if the team knows this, but at Google, FIDO keys have been known to reduce to take the number of account takeovers to zero. And I'll explain that in the next slide. But there is a concept of a FIDO key, and FIDO is a standard for folks who are new to the concept of FIDO. It is an open system as well. At Google, we implemented our own key because we're controlling our supply chain. So we have our own key that can only be used in Google machines. FIDO standards are very well known. A lot of banks are using FIDO standards now, and you see on the next slide that I'll pop into now, some of the second factor authentication solutions are being used by you guys are using that to access your bank accounts or to access your work devices as well. So let's kind of talk a little bit about second two-factor authentication. There are different types of two-factor authentication. Across all of them, they have their own strengths. Most of the strengths come from a convenience perspective, and they all have weaknesses as well. So SMS or voice, I mean, it could be inconvenient to do an authentication based on voice. SMS is a nice to have, but there's a concept of smishing, which adds some vulnerability to SMS in of itself. Backup codes. There are times where you can create backup codes where you could use as your second factor authentication. TOTP. Some banks use TOTP, like where you're able a token type based authentication, where you're able to punch like tokens, numbers from your token, and then punch that into as a second factor authentication mechanism. Mobile push, very common with a lot of the authenticator apps that we have that floats around across literally most platforms. But what makes FIDO keys unique is another person could steal your SMS and do a verification for you. Your backup codes could be stolen from wherever it is that you're keeping it. Your TOTP, if your hardware is stolen, it could be used. Your mobile push, if your phone is being taken away by someone else, someone who you trust, they could use it. But what your FIDO key provides is a binded security with a device that it's already trusted, and you have to be there to verify that you're actually the one gaining access or approving access from an authorization perspective of to that application or to any type of application that you're actually gaining access to. So it makes it phishing resistant. Since we have implemented it at Google, we've seen zero phishing attempts because of our FIDO keys. So just going back, and we specifically, between Wade and I, we specifically took away a lot of the Google slides that we had in here because to be honest, there are other vendors that are out there that might be able that you use. This is all about protecting security. It's not really about selling a solution or selling a product. Uh, Across the attack kill chain, we have email that has security that's built in. We have FIDO key that has security that's built in that prevents a user from opening an attachment, or even when you open an attachment, it asks for your FIDO key such that there will be no replay attacks from the attacker's perspective, even for your open URLs as well. Chrome OS adds endpoint-based protection, and also, and this is not only prevalent to Chrome. Other operating systems out there have endpoint-based protection that you can implement to ensure that when that malicious payload hits the endpoint, it's being protected. And then you can implement solutions, security solutions that prevent lateral movements across an endpoint as well, that detects and prevents lateral movements. And that kind of goes to the next portion of the NIST framework that I'll be covering next. So, from an increasing your posture perspective, there are two sections that I'm going to be looping in together, and that's to detect and respond. How do most organizations typically detect vulnerabilities in the environment, and how do they respond to vulnerabilities in the environment? Uh, Wade has brought up this acronym, SIEM, their SIEM solution. There is a bit of aggregation that most organizations need. An aggregation that combines data from endpoints, data from network, data from identity systems, data from your badging system to identify who is this user and is this a known pattern. And when you combine all of that data together and you apply intelligence on it, then you're able to make actionable action. You can send real life action or actionable you can send actionable intelligence to ensure that you're doing the right thing from a security perspective. So when all of the data are aggregated, you can use modern threat detection system to say, hey, I know for a fact that we've seen this before, and this attack is now happening on 5 systems. So I'm going to use this intelligence to build an indicator of compromise and also create a block rule as an example. Or you want to do some form of hunting and find out how many users in my environment have seen this file hash. If you collect data at that scale, you're able to tell with a huge level of 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 of, of confidence that specific users within your environment has actually received files, a specific file hash. You can also take actions like delete the file at scale. I'm not going to talk a little bit more. I'm not going to talk too much about the product, but for Google, our products for SIEM, that's Security Incident and Event Management, is Chronicle. So let's talk about recovery. The different solutions that are out there. I mean, when you think about ransomware from a personal computer perspective, you're probably thinking, hey, I have Google Drive, and Google Drive gives me the ability to recover files that were deleted. Yes, that could be a way to protect from ransomware. But how do enterprises see ransomware? Well, there are solutions that are out there as well that enterprises could use to integrate, just like Wade had mentioned, from an on-premises world to a cloud world and having a hybrid landscape. There are solutions that are specifically built to ensure that you could do backup and recovery regardless of where your data is. One of the solutions like that, in case you haven't heard before, is called Activio. So having a low recovery point objective where you're taking incremental data captures, where there is a local cache and then that local cache is just a cache, but it's sending the data into buckets. And based on your usage of the data, it determines if it should be in a nearline or cold line type storage. And the data from the cloud is being replicated as you want it to be as well, such that when there is a ransomware, you can use your IOCs or your threat intelligence that's found from your detect section through a system like Chronicle, identify that this is actually a ransomware, and determine that I'm gonna stop backup at this point, and then do some type of cleaning up of the environment and do some type of recovery as well. Kind of go back to the same point that Wade had mentioned. From a NIST framework perspective, it starts with identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recover. And I kind of ended up with that recover section with what you could do with solutions like Activio, and there are few many other solutions out there that integrate very closely with your cloud solution. So here are a couple of recommendations and next steps. Use a framework. It doesn't have to be NIST, but I think NIST works pretty well for this type of use cases. Establish a ransomware protection strategy. Do some type of cyber resilience strategy or some type of assessment, and conduct periodic awareness campaign, because at the end of the day, we users are the weakest links in most environments. Jim, that's it for us. I think we spent an hour. We're planning to spend 45, but I'll pass it back on to you.
No, it's it's great. Definitely appreciate it. Yeah, it I think if you dig into any of those little buckets on any of those slides that you had, you could probably talk at least a whole hour on each one of those. So getting all of it into 1 hour, I think a pretty good accomplishment. So what we'll do now is we'll slide into a question and answer section. Did open up the Q&A. Let me bring it over here. There's a Q&A section built into the tool where you can users can type in questions, because with the platform, just presenters have voice and video. So if you have any questions for Bio and Wade, just type those out. And yeah, Bio and Wade, you can come on camera if you'd like for this section.
Sure.
It'll go 5, 10, 20 minutes. Usually doesn't go 20 minutes, but it just depends on how many questions that people have. All right, looks like there's a couple in the Q&A. I'll read those out so that they'll be available for everybody to hear, and they'll be on the recording later. So there's a couple questions from Will Patterson. Can we hear some examples of low and slow threats and how to detect them? So low and slow threat detection. Do you have some examples so we can get a better idea of what those type of threats are?
Yeah, I think I answered the question on the low and slow threats type detection, and that's a low and slow threat detection really is more of we use machine learning to detect low and slow threats, where you're studying human behavior. I mean, in Wade's word, there are solutions around UEBA that look at user entity behavior and analytics, looks at when a user signs in every morning. If the user signs in at 4 o'clock and signs into a server in say Africa, and 5 months later the user signs in at 8 o'clock but signs into a server in another region, or maybe provisions a server or provisions a compute resource in another region, that becomes an anomaly. And there are security solutions that are available to protect that. Another one of the other example of low and slow threats type detection is from a insider risk perspective.
Okay.
The type of example that I'll give in this case will be, just imagine a user is disgruntled and has decided to leave a company, and prior to when they decided to leave the company, they never used USBs at all. But now they decided to leave, they plugged the USB drive, they copied a bunch of files, and they say, hey, I'm going to try to do this file copying for the next 1 month. And you start noticing on some type of abnormal pattern behavior around copying files, deleting files. There are solutions that are purpose built as well that can detect those type of anomalies. And those are like the low and slow threat type detection, and there are solutions out there. I can give names, but I don't want this to be very Google specific.
Okay, no, thanks for those examples. So the things that where something would be like a hard and fast attack, like a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service. Low and slow is something where there's maybe not a lot of activity happening, but it's something unusual, an outlier type of event that and humans obviously in the chain of action there.
Well, and
Also, if you look at it also from an attack kill chain perspective, was somebody going to say something?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we kind of look back to one of the slides that we covered as well from an attack kill chain perspective, in most environments, when an attacker may already be in that environment, but it's just waiting for the admins to log in on a particular machine. There are times where an admin would say, hey, let me fix your computer for you. You had an issue with your computer, but you're a regular user and you already have a malware. And some admins would be like, let me just sign into your computer. So you use the user would use an elevated privilege to sign in. But the attacker is watching for keyloggers, downloading logs, and then that's the moment the attacker gets the admin passwords. So that's another example of a type of low as low threat. And Wade, I'll pass it on to you. Actually, I think.
Yeah, I was basically in the same thread that you were, Bio. You know, the idea really, when you think about low and slow, is in an active attack, you've got a compressed time window where actions are taking place or events are happening one after another, or near real instantaneous type of thing. With low and slow, you might have step one in that attack take place on day one. Step two may not take place for 30 days.
Okay.
Step three might take place, 90 days later. And so being able to recognize where in that kill chain you're seeing that particular activity gives you a sense of really what that attack flow actually looks like. And Bio's right. Once they've got a beachhead inside the environment, they can afford to sit and wait for whatever period of time they need to be able to escalate privileges, map the network, discover where all of the crown jewels are kept. And many of you probably heard this before. The defender has to be right every time. The attacker only has to be right once.
Right.
And so their ability to be, I hate to use the word patient because that really kind of goes against the concept of maliciousness, but their ability to be patient and wait for the right time to strike. I mean, we see some of those things where the attacker is sitting in the environment for well over a year. Like they got popped a long time ago and they just sat there, they mapped the network, they watched the activities. Like Bio said, they collected and harvested all of the asset or all of the accounts and resources that they were going to need to be able to launch the attack. And all that happened months beforehand. And then you get to kind of the impact phase where all of a sudden in very short order, every red klaxon light goes off and every alert fires on every technology because they've just taken it out.
All right. So no, thanks for that, Wade. All right. Will does have another question on percentage of threats. Maybe there's not an exact percentage, but are there any types of security threats that are not malicious, and what percentage might those be?
I wouldn't have a percentage on that. The accidental data exfiltration that I talked about before would be an example of that. Things like you've got physical security on a data center, but you've got a broken electronic lock or somebody's propped the door open or whatever. Those aren't necessarily malicious.
Sure.
But they represent what could be a potentially sizable threat.
Right. Okay, yeah, so if the electrician's there and he doesn't want to walk all the way out the front door of the data center, just props open the door with a little screwdriver.
Props open the back door, because that's where his truck's parked, so just quick run and right back. Other things, when you think about misconfiguration of technologies, surprisingly common. If you misarchitect an automated thing, like you build your Terraform template wrong and you don't pay attention to it, you blast off 1,000 versions of that in a matter of minutes, and now you've got a whole footprint that's wide open. Not malicious, just wrong. All
right, we've got a few more coming into the Q&A. We have from Dale Thompson. He has quite a few of them, and I'll start at the bottom of the list because I don't know why, but it's about FIDO devices. So we did see the FIDO devices. I think Google uses the Titan key or something like that as their device. But what happens if someone steals your device? Is it like the same risk as losing a cell phone or a laptop? If you lose your FIDO device, what's the impact? Are you at a security risk by losing it?
Well, so if you lose your device, it doesn't necessarily mean you lose your key. First, signing into the device still requires some type of password. And this is a good question, by the way. Signing into the device requires some type of password. So if you lose your device, the user will have to know the password.
Okay.
If the user ever breaks the password, I would imagine not. The next step will be to try to gain access to a site, and that's where the FIDO key comes in. If you're trying to gain access to, say, Gmail or any other type of web application that you already have protected under two-factor authentication, you will require the FIDO key. And it cannot be any FIDO key because it has to be registered on that machine.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of security from that perspective. There are also security around where you could use your devices as well. So if a user steals a device and tries to use it in a different country, as an example, you could block access as well. So best practice from a case of losing a device is to report it as fast as possible. But particular to phishing, FIDO keys, they limit the phishing capability to zero. At least for us at Google.
All right. No, I think that thanks for that. So it's not end of the world if you lose your FIDO key. It's still quite a few steps before they have to break into crack your password, have your key, use it from a location that's within the geofencing if geofencing's on. So it's not nothing. It's maybe not the easiest thing, but nothing to sweat about.
Well, and it only has any potential value for as long as it's, quote, on. Once you've reported it missing, like let's say that my laptop got stolen with my FIDO key in it.
Yep.
On my phone, I can just communicate to the security teams that I've lost my device and my key, and they turn it off. And I mean, there's other stuff we would do too, but in that case, it becomes worthless.
Okay, no, that's cool. That's good to know. And I think in some chats I was seeing that some folks have YubiKeys for their home computers. I think I have a YubiKey, but I haven't ever plugged it in yet. Just collecting dust.
Yeah, I should use it. Bank of America actually they now use YubiKeys for a lot of authentication, which is good. I mean, for personal users, when you want to send money, you can send money using YubiKeys.
All right, cool. All right, so, another question from Dale. And there's a bunch of questions tucked into this question. I'll just read them all. How do you protect yourself against vendor devices and IoT devices that might be easy targets? Do you think personal or company phones and devices being targeted for ransomware? And what do you see as the easiest things that are the easiest devices that are targets?
Wade, I'll let you take this one. It's actually very loaded. I think I've answered quite a few questions already.
Yeah. So in terms of devices coming from vendors, any of the IoT stuff, if they're running software on that, you're always running a risk that there's a vulnerability sitting inside of that either is unknown or just hasn't been disclosed. I think we see that happen periodically. I'll call out Netgear routers just because I had one a couple of years ago and I seem to constantly get security updates on that thing. So you do run a risk. Obviously you want to do homework around what types of devices you're using, the at-home cameras, video doorbells, whatever. In terms of ransomware targets, in a lot of cases, you've got a twofold type of campaign. One is the very specific targeted campaign against a company or a group of individuals, and the other is just the spray where you're just going to send it out and see what hits. And I think In both cases, but more in the spray case, if you've got your personal email or your work email or whatever tied to that, and there's no protection, like Gmail, for example, has some built-in protection based off of what we know, the phishing campaigns that are out there, to automatically eliminate some of that type of stuff. If you don't have any of that, then you do run the risk, and all the major, Office 365's got it. I don't know what others out there, but any of the cloud mail providers at this point are going to have some type of technology in place to at least try to mitigate that. If your only access is through your mobile device, then obviously that becomes the attack vector that you have the potential to get compromised on. But I don't know that they're necessarily specifically looking at mobile phones in particular as targets for ransomware at this point.
All right, thanks, Wade. I'm gonna Dale does have some more questions. I'll jump to those in a second, but Kenny Kahn did have a question in the Q&A as well. So phishing was mentioned as the main way attacks happen. Do you know if phishing was the method for the Colonial, T-Mobile, or the meat company attacks? Do you know if phishing was part of the vector there?
I don't remember offhand.
Me too. I don't remember offhand. Yeah, I don't want to stake a claim. I'm not sure of. No, I don't know.
We'll just have to tell Kenny to Google it.
Right.
Yeah, just Google it, Kenny, please.
Okay, going back to a couple questions from Dale, and these I'm not sure where to break this one up, so I'm just going to read it all in a big block as well. So how do you position your systems to be able to quickly recover from ransomware? How do you protect your data? Do you think we will move to immutable resources? Does cloud-based endpoints and moving to a virtual environment for endpoints cause more headaches or help in ransomware attacks? So I think it's about part of it's protecting data, and then part is, is our cloud-based resources better, worse, help you recover faster? What do you guys think?
So there's always a trade-off between security and access, let's say, or security and operations, right? Because employees need to be able to do the job that they're hired to do, which means they have to have access to whatever assets or resources to be able to do that job function. So you've always got that trade-off there, and it's always a push-pull against that. But generally speaking, the principles you want to have in place are principles of least privilege. You want to have regular review of access controls, regular review of the sensitivity of data so that you understand where your risks actually are. Procedurally speaking, you need to have some kind of backup so that if for whatever reason you need to go back to a previous state of that data, you have the ability to be able to do that. You want to periodically be able to check those in some manner to be able to validate it, whether you're doing something old school like the magnetic tape, whether you're doing some copy in the cloud, whether you're running hot cold DCs to be able to fire up at any given time additional capacity. Depending on the methodology you're using, there are different pieces for you to be able to manage that process and have a fair degree of certainty that the data is going to be good and quickly usable. As to whether moving to a cloud makes things easier or more difficult, I'm employed by Google Cloud, so it makes things much, much, much easier to be able to do that. Seriously though, joking aside, a lot of that depends on how well resourced and how sophisticated the teams are as to whether you're increasing or decreasing your level of difficulty or your level of exposure in cloud versus on-prem.
Right.
On-prem is something that has a long history of being well understood in terms of what your risks actually are. Cloud is something that in the last 10 years has seen a pretty significant hockey stick uptake, but that also means that there are new things that are still being learned about the best way to be able to configure and protect the cloud environments and be able to appropriately use the workloads. I personally think that cloud provides a much better environment because you've got more consistency, you've got better visibility across your cloud resources as long as you're paying attention to the admin consoles, the command consoles, whatever, to be able to understand what your attack surface looks like and where the risks are relative to that.
Yeah, I'm gonna add a little bit of the different context to what you've said, because I thought you said it very well, Wade. At the end of the day, to kind of look at the question around how do you quickly recover from ransomware,
Mm-hmm.
and if you look at the question as well, like does cloud-based endpoints or moving to a virtual environment for endpoint cause more headache or help for ransomware attack? Cloud provides you more agility, but at the end of the day, the cloud uses a model. Cloud conforms with the model called the shared responsibility model.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any advantage you get from the cloud, it's in the fact that the controls are there, but you still have to set them up. I read of a threat, or I read of an attack of very high profile companies just yesterday, and it was based on misconfiguration or lack of configuration of controls that already exist.
Right.
If the controls exist and you're not implementing them, you still will be vulnerable to ransomware attacks. But if the controls exist and you take advantage of the controls, the job of the cloud provider is to make sure the controls are there and there is uptime for your cloud resources. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but moving from an on-prem environment, though, if you're trying to do this in an on-prem environment, what you will need is layer on top of layer of new security controls or security appliances or software to enforce that level of control that the cloud will automatically just provide to you.
Okay. Yeah. So on that shared security model where the cloud provider is giving you that security of the cloud, so
Mhm.
they're securing the physical premises, the network, parts of the network, all that kind of stuff, and then you as the user of the cloud have the security in the cloud. Even it's still your responsibility to put in the controls, take care. Don't have publicly open buckets of data when they should have a tighter control. And yeah, so that's the agility of the cloud should help you be able to recover better. But if you're not paying attention, in either case, if you're not paying attention, you'll be more vulnerable than if you are paying attention, I guess.
That is correct. Yep.
All right, so we've run to the end of the Q&A questions that were typed out. If anybody else has questions, type them out. I do have a couple of things that are not necessarily on the presentation, but career-wise, if anybody is out there and maybe they're a brand new technologist, or maybe they've been in technology for a while and are super interested in security, where any good tips on how to get on that first rung of the ladder of a security professional? Where if you could go, I guess if you could go back in time and talk to yourself on how to become you in 10, 15 years, where would you tell you to start?
Wait, are you gonna take that?
Oh God, where to start? So I ended up in the late 90s taking some certification courses. This was at a time when the Microsoft certifications were pretty hot.
Okay.
And so I started with that, but I actually got my first job in IT because I was a former Marine at the time. I was Marine Corps infantry, and the VP that hired me said he wasn't hiring me because of the piece of paper that didn't mean anything. He was hiring me because that meant that I could be taught.
Okay.
That being a former Marine meant I could be taught. So I changed pretty significantly as I moved into the industry. Once I got in, I made a point, and even when I was in school, I made a point to try to pick up as much as I could from wherever I could, not knowing where there was going to be value around that. But that was how I started. If I was going to go back and tell myself to do it all over again, I think I would have paid more attention to the computer classes in college when I started out, and and just gone directly into it. rather than the circuitous route I took to get there.
All right. Bio, did you want to share any story at all, or should we leave it at Wade's advice?
I mean, what I would say is security, technology in general can be taught. I really like Wade's pitch around being teachable. But probably what's most important about around what's more important to me about being I'm gonna take a step back here. I need more water. But what's more important than being teachable is having curiosity. No matter what profession you're in, if you have curiosity, you will be successful. Just curiosity to see how does this work and
Right.
asking the why. Most recruiters, when I am looking to hire someone, I'm looking for folks that have curiosity, folks that are curious and passionate about something. And if you're passionate and you're teachable and you have curiosity, you will not only learn, but you also go far. Uh, People weren't born to be cybersecurity experts. They had the curiosity. They kept learning. They kept reading. They went to school, but you don't actually need the school. There's tons of information that you can read out there. I also like the idea of certifications. I think certification give you that confidence booster when you go
Right.
through it. It gives you the confidence booster to attack problems, to think about problems differently, because you're exposed to a wide range of concepts. So those would be my tips. But yeah, anybody can be a security person if you have the curiosity and you're teachable, you have the aptitude to learn.
All right. Here's we'll leave this as the final one from Ramji. Now that you are in security, does it give you a lot of gratification? It seems like a challenge all day, every day. So, would you say being in security is there? How much gratification do you get from being in the security field?
Well, the fact that I get more problems keep thrown at me is something good. It keeps me busy. So not as much of gratification, but at least it keeps me. It makes me want to solve interesting problems every single day, and there's always a problem that I've never seen before, and that is probably the gratification, or at least that's what keeps me going. Wait,
Well,
it'd be interesting to know what your thoughts are.
yeah, it actually forces you to solve the difficult problems every day. I've supported a lot of different technologies over the years.
Sure.
Security in general can take a lot of different directions, lots of different ways to have the moniker of security put into your title or into your CV. But I have found that, well, one of the things I always say, I tell my kids this, if I'm the smartest person in the room, then I'm in the wrong room. That there are always people that I try to surround myself with that are smarter than me, like Bio, that know things that I don't know for me to be able to learn from. And so when I think about being gratified by the job, I'm very much gratified by the people that I work with. They happen to be in a similar space, but they're very smart people doing a lot of interesting things. And so I get to continuously learn new stuff and just continue to develop as a professional in the space. So I think from that perspective, that security moniker really has been rewarding for me from that perspective. That's pretty funny. Yeah. So ideally, security should be baked into everything that is in IT, right? Security should be a fundamental part of every operation that takes place in an organization today, because we're so interconnected and so dependent on technology and devices to be able to get any of the work done. Now, that being said, the way a security analyst operates day to day can vary wildly. You've got some teams that are more sophisticated, in particular financial services, I think have been areas that I've had experience. They've got very specialized teams that do a lot of different things. So a security analyst might be somebody that's responsible for watching the endpoint platforms, or doing configuration analysis on the container side of things up in the cloud. It might be somebody that's responsible for digging through SIM alerts, looking for very specific types of threats, even kind of that low and slow stuff that we talked about earlier. There are others as you get more senior that are kind of sitting back and waiting for stuff to bubble up to them. Like perhaps they've got an active threat taking place. Maybe they're deploying a new technology. The role itself will vary. Generally, they also have an opportunity, at least in the good teams that I've seen, to be able to break away from their desks for a while and go do something else. Like Google has the 20% project rule, and I've seen some security teams implement that where they're able to actually get away from the security piece, the things that they do on a day-to-day basis, and be able to go pursue something else. Maybe that's learning about an APT group. Maybe that's, like we talked about, getting certifications. Maybe that's learning a different part of the business where they were EDR and now they want to be cloud or something like that. But it can vary quite a bit. The machine learning piece of that, the data science piece of that, is something that most organizations we don't see have it heavily in use right now, but it's an area of interest that's growing pretty rapidly. Again, the more sophisticated teams have already deployed some flavor of that, where you've got data scientists that are responsible for actually analyzing the security telemetry. They're putting machine learning models in place. We're doing a lot of work with the BigQuery piece right here in-house to be able to expand and build on that and make that available. We've got a couple of financial services organizations that are helping us develop some of that stuff. We've got retail that is very interested in being able to develop models for what their experience is so that they can understand things like fraud detection, which, that waste management piece for them is important, whether it be from a credit card perspective, whether it be from a physical inventory perspective. So lots of different things happening around that, but it is something that, while is very buzzy right now, is something that does have some real meat to the bone kind of behind all that marketing spin. Hopefully that helped a little bit. I do like what you talked about, though, that security should be resident in all of the IT operations that takes place throughout the organization.
That's completely right. Yeah, and the one last thing that I probably would add to what you said, Wade, is in the fact that as security analysts, you might be asked to be part of red teams and blue teams where you're doing competitions. Hey, I want to break this environment, or I want to defend this environment. Just one of the ways to kind of sharpen your security hunting skills or your analysis skills as well. So yeah, being a security analyst can be a fun role. Also, to just kind of add to the point of machine learning, no model is perfect. Every model is just a base point, and every model can be tweaked to continue to harness more data sources and get better at predicting the future outcomes.
Very true.
All right. Thank you, Bio. Thank you, Wade. I'm going to give you the silent clap because I don't want to clap into the microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending time with us today, sharing your knowledge. Maybe we'll see you again in the future.
Absolutely, we look forward to it. Well, thank you very much for having us, Jim. This was very good, and yeah, we look forward to being part of this GDG in the future.